So I got the basic nuts and bolts of the animation. I'm going to add the rest of the planets kind of off presentation here, but the thing that I want to focus on next, there's two things really, is that I want to focus on the background. Right now if I render this thing, it's pretty simple in terms of it's floating in this empty vacuum, and I think it'd be great to have some kind of a star field in the background. In addition to that, I want to focus on adding a couple of lights and maybe even an asteroid belt. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on generating a texture for the background. Now, if you don't have access to Photoshop, I'll demonstrate this in Photoshop. It's a really simple technique. And if you don't have access to Photoshop or something similar to it, you can always find some resources online. You might even be able to find some bundled with Cinema 4D, but I think it's always much more effective if you can create your own content rather than find something online. In fact, my goal here is that I'm going to create a sky object, and to that sky object I'm going to apply the star field that I generate. I'm going to make a pretty high-res file so it doesn't tile too often, or if it does, we're not going to really be tuned into it. You know, if I'm creating this content from the ground up, I can make it as big or as small as I want it to be. So let me share with you a really quick technique on how to quickly generate a star field. Now, I will say that there is something that you might discover inside Cinema 4D where you can generate a procedural star field by starting off with a basic material. I would avoid that because anytime you animate with this procedural technique, you're going to get a lot of flicker. So we'll avoid that, but if you discover it, just know that there is this star element, this star background element that's bundled within Cinema 4D, but we don't want to use it. So my technique is I'm going to jump into Photoshop, and I'm going to choose File, New Document, and I'm going to make something a width and height of 8 inches, and I'm going to leave the resolution set to, say, 200 or 300. Now, typically whenever I'm creating content for screen, I always work at 72 dpi. However, in this case, because of the technique we're going to use, I want a denser, more high-resolution image, okay? So if you're in the habit of working to 72 dpi, resist the urge to convert this to, say, 24 by 24 by 72 dpi, or, you know, 32 and so on, because we really want the high resolution with the way that this technique is going to work. So I'm starting off with an 8x8 at 300 at a resolution of 300, and I'll say OK. And, you know, I might change this after I see how it works, but I think this will do the trick. I'm going to create a new layer. So I'm in the Layers panel. Let me get rid of this history bar here. I'm in the Layers panel, and I'm going to choose to edit Fill, and I'm going to fill with 50% gray. So I'll say OK. I want to make sure that my foreground and background swatch are black and white, and I'll choose Filter, Render, Add Noise. And when I add noise, I'm going to make sure it's has a Gaussian distribution, and I'm going to make sure that it's monochromatic, and I'm going to bump the amount of noise way up, and I'll say OK. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to blur this a little bit so that I can kind of more evenly distribute the information that's here. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur. I'm going to apply a Gaussian blur, and I'll blur it, let's say, like 2 pixels or so. Now, again, this, you know, this is, you know, purely experimentation, so you might want to change these values as you go. But the minute that I create this grayscale noise and I blur it a little bit, what I can do is I can go to Image, Adjustments, and I'll go into my levels here. If I can find them, there it is, Levels. It's Command L. Okay, and when I open up the levels, what I want to do is I want to bump up the contrast in this image, and so I'll bring the darks way up, and I'll bring the lights in, and I'll just kind of compress these values until I get somewhat closer to the image that I want. So I can compress some of these stars out of the equation. I can, you know, condense these down or back them off. And in really simple terms, I think I have, you know, the basics of the star field that I wanted to create. So I'll say OK. Now I could just save that as it is, or I could, you know, kind of, you know, paint some nebular type clouds in here, and I'll you know, probably push that forward offline here. But I wanted to share with you a really basic strategy to create this star field, and you can find alternatives to this online. But the nice thing about this is you can get a really quick, really high res star field. And I'll choose File, Save As. And this project, let me back out of here for a second. Let me just jump into my project folder. I'm going to go into my class folder, into my solar system, and I have a texture folder, so I'm going to borrow that texture folder, and I'm going to save a Photoshop document of space or stars into this project folder. And you'll notice that I actually have provided a couple of stars.psd files already, so if you look inside your texture field, or excuse me, your texture folder, you should find some of these assets, but I wanted to show you how to build it from the ground up. I'm going to go back to Photoshop. I'll say File, Save As. I'm going to keep it as a Photoshop document, and I'll jump into my project folder here. Simulation, Solar System, into my text field, and I'll call this Stars 03. Try that again. Stars 03. And I'm going to keep it as a Photoshop document. Photoshop documents are a little less efficient in terms of render time, but they're they're great files to use. I'm going to get in the habit of using Photoshop files as needed because I can preserve layers. Cinema 4D certainly doesn't mind if we use them. So I'm back in Cinema 4D. I've saved my texture into the search path of the project folder that I'm working on. And I'm going to go into my Environments tab, and I'm going to find a sky object. Okay? Now, I'm going to identify my sky object, and I'm going to build a material based on that space texture. So I'll just, or that stars texture, I'll double click to create a material. I'll double click again, and I'll call this space background. I'm going to make sure that the color channel is selected, and I'm going to go find the texture field. I'll click on the ellipsis, and I'll just load in stars 03. I'll turn off specular, and I'll close this, and now I'll apply that to my background. Now, I'll give this a quick render, and we'll see what the background looks like. It looks like it's probably, yeah, it's scaled a little too large. Okay, that's still pretty huge, so it's not... I want it to tile many more times than that. Okay, that's way too big. And so with that material tag selected, I'll go down into the attributes of my sky, or my texture that's applied to the sky, and I'll tell it to tile, let's say 5 times along the U and 5 times along the V. And rather than render the whole scene, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this render region, and I'll just render a little bit of the background. Okay? It's probably still a little big, and there's probably too many stars, and I can modify that in Photoshop. But let's bump this up to, let's say, 8. And again, this is really just dependent on the resolution. Wow, look at that. I'm seeing some tiling going on now. I don't want that. Yep, see those vertical lines right there? I think that's a problem, right? We don't want this seam in our background because this is something that our eye is going to identify. And so maybe we'll jump into Photoshop, or let's render it and see what's going on here. So yeah, I'm definitely getting this vertical seam, which is not good. The horizontal seam almost takes care of itself, and I think when this is rendered, we won't really see that. But let me show you a trick on how to make textures tiled in Photoshop. So I'm just going to jump back in to the file that I just created. I'm going to go under Filter. I believe it's under Other. Yeah, here's the Offset filter. And so what I want to do is I want to offset my image. Okay, and the way that the offset works is by default it should wrap around. And as I move this vertically and horizontally, what it's doing is it's pushing one edge. It's pushing one edge on the end and pushing those pixels over to the other side of the document. And so this is going to be kind of a tough one to see it, but once I just kind of move these numbers around, here's the intersection. Here's the vertical and the horizontal. Okay, let me do this in a new document. Let me just say, okay, let me create a new, just for the sake of demo, I'll generate some is a little bit more obvious. Let me go to Filter, Render, Clouds. And if I go to Filter, Other, Offset, and I offset this, okay, see what it's doing? It's taking the corners of the image and let's see, let me just back this up a little bit. It's taking the edges of the document and causing them to overlap in the center. So if we offset this and cause the ends to wrap around, we could go back in and we could take some time and kind of, you know, blur out or paint in and cause this texture to be a little bit more seamless in the center. And then the idea here is that when this texture, when this edge lines up with this edge, this part of the texture matches up seamlessly with that part of the texture, okay? And you get rid of this, you know, crazy tiling line here in the center. And so it's going to be really easy to fix that in our star field. I can actually just probably go in, let me fill the background with black, so I'll choose the background. I'll choose to edit fill with black. I'll say OK. And I'm just going to go in. Probably the easiest way to do this is go in with the eraser, and maybe I'll even load some kind of textured brush to dirty up the edges here and make sure I'm on the right layer. And I'm just going to kind of go through let's see, I need to refill with black. I inadvertently erased the background. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Oops. There we go. Again, I was in the wrong layer, so let me get back in here. That's what I'm trying to do. So I'm just trying to get in here and kind of dirty up the hard vertical and hard horizontal line. Okay, so let me just kind of get rid of some of my stars that are lining up a little too, it's a little too obvious. Get rid of some of these other stars real quick. I think we're good. Still some stuff in here that is catching my eye. There we go. So I think we got rid of the tile again. I could spend more time. I might want to add some stars back in. In fact, I might have created some patches in here that our eye is going to jump to, but that's okay. For the sake of the demo, I think that'll be pretty clean. I'll just save this document because I use that in Cinema 4D. When I go back and reload this texture, we should see these hard vertical and horizontal lines disappear. So let me go back into my space texture, and I'll just tell this to reload image. And there, now we can't see that line. This line that we see in here, that's just our horizon line. And I'll give that a quick render. Yeah, that's much better. The star field's a little too dense. You know, I'll probably go back into Photoshop and adjust my levels and cause a lot of these stars to drop back out. In fact, let me do that really quickly. Just Command L to adjust my levels. There we go. That's probably more what I want, something like that. I'll say OK. I'll save right over top of it. I'll do the same trick. I'll double click on the texture. In the texture pull down menu, say Reload Image. Much fewer stars, and that's again the beauty of working with a Photoshop image, is that I can just jump in and out, back and forth between Photoshop. That's exactly what I want. So I got my background image in there. That looks pretty good. Again, you don't have to go into Photoshop if you don't have it, but it's a technique I wanted to share with you. I'll push this forward and share with you just a really quick workflow on the lighting that I'm going to set up, and then we'll talk a little bit about MoGraph. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.